I'd like to join in welcoming everyone here. And if you have the lesson packets, you might look at lesson number 19, page number 39. If you need a copy, on the back table in the back, there are a few lessons left, I think, for Numbers. And then the first part of Deuteronomy is also available there if you want a hard copy of that. I'm going to try to get through the next couple of lessons, at least make my notes something into something representable in just a little while. As we finish out the book of Numbers, we are coming to the end of the fourth section of this great story of the Pentateuch. And I've been trying to emphasize throughout this class that Genesis through Deuteronomy, though they have distinct focuses as we work through them, this is one cohesive story, and that Moses is at least writes the majority of it, if not all of it, as he works through Genesis through Deuteronomy. He is telling a story that people need to hear, the Israelites. Definitely the second generation, but even partially the first generation. And this is something that was not just for them, but is also for us now. And so as we look at this one story, we've tried to conclude every book with some connections to the rest of the Pentateuch, and maybe even expand beyond that a little bit. So that's what we're going to do this morning as we conclude the book of Numbers. And the first section, we're going to focus in on this idea of promise. And this is a theme that's been running all the way through the Pentateuch, is the idea of the promise of God. And what are the primary promises that God made to the patriarchs in Genesis?
One of them is the nation promise, clear back to when Abraham was called out of Ur of the Chaldeans. He said, God's not going to make you great. And then he repeats that promise in varying forms, but it's essentially the same idea, making your descendants as the dust of the earth in chapter 13, after he and Lot had separated. Look toward the stars of heaven, so shall your descendants be in chapter 15. I'll make you a father of many nations in chapter 17. I'll multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven in chapter 22. And that's just to Abraham. He goes on and repeats similar words to Isaac and to Jacob.
Very good. And we've been seeing hints of this. Remember, Genesis would not have been written to Abraham. This is Moses writing to the Israelites about what happened to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we typically define it in those three: land, nation, seed. And I think that is helpful, though I think that is somewhat limited because we do have other promises associated with the patriarchs. And furthermore, it is not simply just here is the literal physical fulfillment. We have this kind of moving into the New Testament as well. But this concept of God blessing Abraham and his descendants seems to be the focus of all of these promises. That we have God telling Abraham, if you will obey me, here is what I am going to offer you. I'm going to offer that you will have descendants that will become a mighty nation. And what do we see in Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers? We are seeing the fulfillment of this, that we are seeing God completing this blessing of many descendants to Abraham. We are seeing in Genesis that this concept of God saying, and your descendants will inherit this land. You are going to be a sojourner here, but your descendants will inherit this land. So it's always pushing forward. And I would suggest that as we look at these Genesis promises, and then we follow them through the Pentateuch, there is always a push forward. And even when we get to the end of the conquest, and maybe we even extend that to the establishment of the monarchy, that there is still always a push forward with all of those. It's never like in the Old Testament, they look back and say, that's the end. They saw themselves as part of the fulfillment and that there was even greater fulfillments coming. And the New Testament definitely bears that out. And so in Numbers, we are making these connections between the promises of God and how we are seeing active fulfillment of these promises in Numbers and beyond. How does the book of Numbers show that God is fulfilling his promises to the patriarchs?
Well, one way is the census that they took. They were counting just the fighting men, and that was a large number. But then if you take all the rest of the people, that
And I was doing some personal reading this morning, and I found that expression that numbered as the sand of the sea, or as you see another parallel in the promises of the stars of the heavens. You see that same kind of idiom, that same expression in the grain that was gathered in the time of Joseph. This is an expression to say it's just beyond number. And the census shows that even if you take a portion of Israel, we're seeing how 75 has become hundreds of thousands, and that's not even inclusive of the whole number of God's people, and it's going to go much further than that as you work forward in the story. Any additional thoughts on how Numbers is showing how God is being faithful to his promises? Trevor?
You see the land promise almost fulfilled, but even in a sense, you still see God working with the people to purify the rebellious remnant so that he can prepare the people to take the land.
So one nation misses the opportunity at the inheritance, but that doesn't mean God has said, okay, I'm done with the promise to the patriarchs. It's pushing forward again. Lance?
Yeah, in regard to something that was mentioned last class, I believe, there were so many babies being born during the time of the wilderness. There were so many people dying. Do that in 40 years. We look at things, it's like, oh, there's a lot of people that died at this time. There's a lot of babies that were born, especially originally here, They spent 40 years seeing that take place. And yet, even though the number was a little smaller, when they did the second census after the 40 years, it was still huge. So that alone could tell them that promise is still there. This is a great nation still.
Absolutely. Okay, this may be a completely strange connection, but hear me out for just a second as I want to build on something Lance said. I was listening to a video that was kind of an apologetics video about, the question was, why did God create mosquitoes? And the speaker in this video was trying to discuss, various reasons connected to the mosquitoes and things like that. He made a point that even if we do not fully understand the purpose, we can see how if you start to remove things, we see how it hurts everything else. And as you work through this story, what we are finding is that God is fulfilling his promise in ways that we would not anticipate. And yet, we see how it works out perfectly, the way God wants it to work. And really, it is, if you go back to the creation story, God had a good purpose for everything, and then sin messes it up. Isn't that what we are seeing in the book of Numbers, is that God has this good plan for his people, and their sin is ruining what he would want for his people. Sam, and then did you have something too, Stephen? All right, Sam?
Well, I thought about in Numbers 14, where God is just fed up with the people and he was ready to destroy them, and he tells Moses, I will destroy them and I will create another nation, through you. And then Moses pleads on behalf of the people, and we see that God relents and, does not destroy the people, but, in spite of their unfaithfulness, God is merciful, and he continues his promises to fulfill the promise he made to Abraham.
Absolutely. This is laying a foundation. We've already seen it previously in Genesis. Stephen preached on this. We talked about it in our class, how that God is faithful amidst even the unfaithfulness of the patriarchs. We're seeing God being faithful even amidst the unfaithfulness of his people. That theme is going to continue when you get into the prophets. It says, God, we often just use this as a proof text for God is immutable, God is unchangeable. But he says, therefore, O Ephraim, you are not destroyed. And so we're seeing this concept of this character of God is the underpinning of every action of God. And this is pointed out vividly in Numbers, so that there is a sense in which when we get to Deuteronomy, and Moses doesn't pull any punches in the historical review in the first 3 chapters. He says, you did this. Even he's connecting them to their fathers. He says, even I couldn't go in because of what you provoked me to do. It's almost as Moses is giving his own farewell speech, eulogy, just before he goes, he is saying, you need to learn a hard lesson. And coming back to Lance's comment, building on Sam's comment, that means every time they buried someone, that was a reminder of this is what happens when we rebel against God. And they needed to learn those lessons. And we need to learn these lessons. This is the faithfulness of God, and we need to try to respond in like faithfulness.
But that generation that received that judgment, die in the wilderness, raised a faithful generation too. They continued to follow through the wilderness and raised a faithful generation to follow them.
All right, any other thoughts? All right, let's see. We've kind of talked through that. Did anybody have anything else on section number 1? All right, then let's go to section number 2. And another theme that we could see if we connect Numbers with Exodus is this idea of the providence of God. Now, this is kind of a representation of his faithfulness. And so God has made promises in Genesis. We're seeing the faithfulness of God to his promises. God was providential for his people in Exodus. We're seeing that same kind of faithfulness represented. And I offered you several passages to look at, chapter 15 of Exodus, 16, 17. Compare that with Numbers 11 and 20 and 21. What do the pre- and post-Sinai provisions of food and water reveal about God and his people? So let's start with, what do these representations of provision show us about God?
One that he will provide. He did not, as he was often charged with, bring them out into the wilderness in order to kill them. He brought them out into the wilderness, and he did, in fact, allow them to suffer some want in the beginning so that he could show them that he would provide.
Absolutely. And we're going to hold on to that thought when we get to Deuteronomy 8 in our study of Deuteronomy, because he does point out what he was doing with giving them want. Any other thoughts?
What does it reveal about people? It revealed about them and how fickle they are and how short their trust in God lasts.
Very good. You know how we have talked about this idea of God is trustworthy, therefore we trust. God is gracious, therefore we are gracious. We are grateful to God. Do we not see that Numbers is kind of a case study on what does it look like when you don't respond to the character of God rightly? And this, I think, is something that we are to carry through for ourselves, is that we see the faithfulness of God. We see the providence of God, the graciousness of God. And we are appalled often as we tell these stories to our children in classes of how could they be so ungrateful and so faithless? And yet, we need to take a hard look at ourselves as well, because they had physical things that they were doing. Do we not sometimes, both physically and spiritually, take things for granted and fail to appreciate who God is? And aren't there so many Christians that fall away, that give up their allegiance to Jesus? This is a case study of what humanity in rebellion against God looks like. And the lesson is to be a positive one for the second generation and for us. Don't act like them. How do you do that? You appreciate who God is, his graciousness. You appreciate his faithfulness and show the kind of gratitude that is necessary. I would connect this with Romans chapter 1 in that as you're going through the idolatry of seemingly primarily Gentile people, but some expand that to all people in Romans chapter 1. But as you have this idolatry, he says, neither were they grateful, neither were they thankful. Notice, even though they don't have the idol of Exodus chapter 32 in their presence, and we, as far as we know, maybe at this point in Numbers, they don't necessarily have any graven images before them. They're acting just like the idolaters, and that they are being ungrateful to the God who is providing for them when they need it most. Any additional thoughts there before we go on to the next question?
we were suddenly shut off from every restaurant in this town, even the grocery stores, and we had nothing but manna, the way it's described. How long would it be before we grew tired of that menu and perhaps lashed out at God?
Right. Let's just, I know we don't like to think back to this, but let's just think back about 4 years. How many people went completely crazy because they didn't have all the things that they wanted at their fingertips the moment they wanted it? Maybe we need some of those times of wilderness want in order to push us toward gratitude and thankfulness to God. All right. Even though God gives his people what they need at Sinai and Kadesh Barnea, the Israelites rebel against him. What similarities and or differences do you see between the two rebellions at Sinai and Kadesh Barnea? And if you don't see any, or if you see contrast, you can bring those up. So similarities and differences.
One similarity about both groups, for whatever reason, completely forget wonderful works that have been accomplished before the events that were about to take place and lose faith.
Right. And a parallel to that, which is interesting to me, is that they see the great work of God among them. And then what kind of pushes them into rebellion? It seems like it is fear as a primary emotion that is, and not a good fear. At Sinai, they are afraid of the presence of God, and they don't want him to talk to them. They don't want to be in his presence. And then at Kadesh Barnea, it's fear of these people are like giants. And so I think this is something that is important for us to think through, is that why is probably the most often cited prohibition in the Bible, do not be afraid? Because God knows how we can twist fear into something that is unhealthy and that is detrimental to us. And we see that in these rebellions is great work of God, but then we start focusing on the fear and we abandon our faithfulness to God. Any other thoughts?
Another failure that Sarah and I talked about yesterday was a failure in leadership over the people. So we have Aaron, who should have taken more of a leadership position and put a stop to what the people were trying to do in Exodus 32. And then the 10 spies who were in that position of authority to give a good report or a bad report, and they failed in their purpose.
Excellent. Good point. Any other thoughts? Michael, did you have something?
But it's not a difference in their rebellions, because I think we see the same short-sightedness and entitled mentality, both before and after Sinai. But after Sinai, in other words, after they have accepted the covenant, after they've entered into the covenant, is probably a better way of saying it, God provides when they complain, but it always comes with, I don't want to say strings attached, but in other words, okay, you want quail? Fine, have all the quail you can stand and more. So let me show you just how what you're after really isn't what you need. He didn't do that so much before Sinai. And after Sinai, he provides, but then there's also a curse or a plague that comes because of their ingratitude.
And to that point, I want to just comment very quickly on the idea of, for instance, the quail, that he says, okay, you can have as much as you want until it comes out your noses. And the idea is they go after it, and instead of learning the lesson from the abundance, they are showing an improper attitude that they're not learning the lesson that God is trying to teach them by sending them this abundance of quail. And so what happens? Then a plague comes. A very superficial reading of that says he gave them what they wanted, they started eating, and then he sends a plague upon them. It's because of how they're reacting to what he is trying to teach them with that abundance. And so we just see this sad rebellion throughout. Any other thoughts?
Just to follow up on that, the exception is in Numbers 21, where apparently they were out of water. We don't read of any complaint, just that God provides, and they sing a song of gratitude. So maybe he had more the second generation by that time, and not so much of the first generation there. They had learned the lesson.
Right. And though I'm not going to be making a lot of connections beyond to the next section, I'll leave that to Stephen. maybe we have an interesting parallel there with one of the few positive points in Samson's life, where God is going to provide for him. Why? Because he prays and shows some level of thanksgiving. Sam?
I don't know, maybe it's just me, but it seems like in Numbers, the failures of the people, the contentions draw more of God's wrath than they did back in Exodus and Leviticus.
Right. And so it is interesting, maybe to Brad's point, tying those together, is now they have entered into covenant. Do we see a stricter judgment that is coming post-Sinai? And even kind of the renewal of the covenant. So you have them acting immorally, idolatrously, and then they have to renew the covenant, and now we're seeing you claim to be my people, you've said you will be my people twice. He is going to hold them accountable to that loyalty. Any other thoughts?
One other similarity, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, they in both cases, they look back to Egypt and remember only the little bitty good stuff they had and forgot all of the terrible things that they were trying to escape there. And so their focus was totally skewed. And wanted to go back, even wanted to go back.
All right, section number 3, as we compare with Leviticus, if Exodus brings holiness on stage, and I don't know what, I think I kind of messed up in my writing here, so let me edit a little bit. If Exodus brings holiness on stage, Leviticus spotlights it, and Numbers introduces both positive and negative characters to the audience. Leviticus primarily emphasizes the importance of holiness through its statutes, and Numbers through its stories or its narratives. Leviticus had already demonstrated that God had set apart a priesthood and a land. How does Numbers show that Israel failed to learn the holiness that Leviticus was trying to teach? So thinking specifically about holiness, how do the stories of Numbers show that they have, what are some of the stories in Numbers that show a failure there?
I would say the major ones, chapter 25, if they had embraced Leviticus, they never could have fallen into the curse. They would have remained blessed. Balaam's plots would not have landed. You can't. I think of the Count of Monte Cristo. It's Brother Waldron's favorite book. He sets up traps that only wicked people fall into. So this should not have been a trap that should have been effective for Israel, but it was.
Good point. Any other thoughts on that, or other passages in Numbers?
So many significant failures, it seems to me, that Miriam and Aaron rebelled against Moses, Korah and his rebellion. You had the people contending with God and Moses because there was no food and water in chapter 21 and chapter 25 that Stephen brought out. And then God brings the plague on them, and it just, the people haven't learned the lesson.
Quick, Trevor.
One of the other lessons you see from Leviticus is the importance of the priesthood, and not just anybody can come before God. He has certain kinds of people, certain roles, certain character, if you will. And you see the rejection of Moses over and over again as God's prophet. And so it's that same kind of indirect rejection of God by rejecting the person that He sanctified. They're indirectly rejecting God as well.
Good point. Any other thoughts? As you look at each of these cases, it seems like they have forgotten what holiness. What does holiness mean?
Set apart, sanctified.
Set apart. The focus of Leviticus is a set apart priesthood and a set apart people. And then as you move to the end of Leviticus, that set apart priesthood and that set apart people are going to reside in a set apart land. And what do in Numbers? They reject the priesthood, they reject the morality, and they reject the land. Numbers is almost a direct foil of Leviticus. Leviticus says, this is how I want my people to be. Numbers says, let's see how they failed at every point of holiness in the book. And I think, again, this is showing how the first generation failed. I'm not saying that the second generation was perfect. In fact, we see that they even need to come into the covenant because of the failure of their parents when they get to Gilgal. But we have this kind of picture of this is the picture of profanity in Numbers, of what happens when you make common everything that God has made holy. And you see the results of that. And so that would tie us directly to, at least for the first generation, the application of Leviticus 26 comes true of this is what I meant by blessings and curses. And this is what you are experiencing. And this is what you will, as second generation Israelites, experience if you walk the same path as your profane parents. Any other thoughts there? All right, then let's move on to section number 4. Kind of set the stage for what we're going to be looking at in Deuteronomy. And I'll go ahead and say it now, even though I was planning on talking about it when we get to Deuteronomy proper. But as we move into Deuteronomy, there's a sense in which this is kind of the climax of the big book, the Pentateuch. But there is a sense in which it's a transition book that is preparing us for what is to come. And when I talk about liberal scholars, whenever I say liberal scholars, I'm talking about people who don't even believe in the resurrection of the dead or the inspiration of the Bible. I know that we often have a very limited sense of liberal that's just even just beyond what Scripture teaches. But when I talk about liberal scholars, that's what I'm talking about. And so liberal scholars, when they look at the formation of the Old Testament, they would try to say that Moses never wrote the book of Deuteronomy, that it was written years later, and that what they have is they call it a Deuteronomistic historian. And they say that whoever wrote Deuteronomy also wrote all the books that came after because there are so many connections. Might I suggest an alternative, that maybe Moses is the speaker here, that God is the author, and that he's trying to make connections to the book of Deuteronomy with later authors. Now, having said that, I do think it is important that what some liberal scholars have noted is that there are some very special connections between Deuteronomy and then Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And what that tells us is that the author of Joshua on through 2nd Kings, whether that be one or more authors, what we have there is that they are specifically using the language of Deuteronomy to tell their story of Israel. And I don't know if Stephen's going to get into some of that or if Brian's going to get into some of that as well. But we are going to see connections to Deuteronomy over and over and over again. And so what I want us to think about is that we should see connections between Genesis through Numbers and Deuteronomy, because this is one book written by Moses. But what we're also going to see is this is the transition. This is getting us ready for what is coming next quarter, as we're going to see these various connections. So Numbers is kind of moving us into Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy is going to move us into Joshua. And so the stories in Numbers are setting the stage for the sermons in Deuteronomy. For instance, Numbers details the failure of the first generation of the Israelites, and Deuteronomy records the exhortation to the second generation. That's not to say that Numbers was not an exhortation to the second generation. It's just, here are the stories, here is the exhortation. And Numbers shows how the first generation rejected the promised land, and Deuteronomy urges the second generation to not make the same mistake. A common element in Numbers and Deuteronomy, which prepares for Joshua, is the commissioning of Joshua to lead Israel into the promised land. And I think this concept of leadership is going to be the connection point in Deuteronomy. Is here's what their leader Moses says. Here is the one who's going to take up the mantle of Moses. And so I asked you to read Numbers 27 and Deuteronomy 31 and summarize the transfer of leadership from Moses to Joshua, and why do you suppose both Numbers and Deuteronomy describe this commission? So what did you see as some interesting parallels between the commissioning of Joshua in Numbers, the commissioning of Joshua in Deuteronomy, and why? Why were these connections made?
have that, I think, unequivocal, here is God's chosen leader to take up the mantle that Moses is setting down, which would have been a massive chore.
Absolutely. And real quick, again, to tie to something I was reading this morning back in Genesis, is do you remember why Joseph told, what Joseph told Pharaoh as to why God had given him two dreams? Because that repetition means this is surely to happen. Maybe we're seeing some of that same concept of why repeat things in the Bible? Because God has determined this is sure to happen. Trevor?
I think you also see a difference in perspective. The account in Numbers seems to be God speaking to Moses directly. And you see what appears to be Moses interceding for the people one more time, where he says, let the Lord appoint for a man. So you see that Moses still cares about the people, still concerned about the people, even though he's on the way out. And you see God there as well. And then in the Deuteronomy account, I think you see Joshua being set up and being recognized as this is the person that the people need to obey. So there's an emphasis on not just this private conversation, but now here's Joshua in front of the people and God saying, this is the person that you need to listen to and follow him, do what he says.
Very good. And is this a theme that we could see throughout Numbers? Is whenever they have said, we want leaders to go into the land, God says, that's a good thing, go ahead. And then they follow the advice of the majority. Then they say, well, what importance is Moses? And they have their own leaders rise up. What happens? They get swallowed. And so are we seeing a theme of when the people elect their own leaders, it has led to failure. When they rely on God's elected leaders, that's when it's going to be well for the people. Any additional thoughts there on the commission of Joshua?
You see a connection in Numbers that it's because of Moses' failure that he's not going to be able to take them into the land. And so that was recorded in Numbers, so it's sort of an internal connection that doesn't necessarily stand out the same way in Deuteronomy. So that's one difference.
And things that have gotten popular now, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of them because usually they get twisted, but is to have what-if stories of what if this instead of that. But I just do kind of wonder, what if Moses had led the people into the land? What might that have looked like? And I think the point of Numbers and Deuteronomy is it would look an awful lot like the faithful leadership of Joshua. That we don't see, unlike what we've seen over and over again, is failure. Now we're seeing this is success. Even because of Moses' failure, he's not allowed to go in, but you see the success of the next generation, Joshua. Any other thoughts? All right. Leave it there. Let's go to section number 5, see if we can get this in the next 2 minutes. Several Psalms, so kind of moving outside the Pentateuch here, but several Psalms refer to events in Numbers. Choose one or more of the following Psalms, indicate what event or events in Numbers the Psalm references, and explain why the psalmist included the reference. And so some where you can find allusions to Numbers are Psalm 78, 95, 105, 106. Those aren't the only ones, but those are definitely some of the clearest. What did you find interesting connections to Numbers in one or more of these Psalms? And why do you think the psalmist did it?
In Psalm 78, there are numerous references back to Numbers. Verse 38, where Moses pleads to the Lord to forgive the people. Verse 41, Israel time and time again tested the Lord. I got ahead of myself. I got down to my bottom notes instead of the top ones. But in verse 12, we see the trek of the spies through the land. Verse 15 of Psalm
Stephen and Brian?
I think Psalm 106, it really encapsulates the purpose, which is it lists out all these failures, most of which happen in Numbers, but all that to say, you are a great God. Because look at how you continue to stick with us when we failed you so very often.
So why, another reason would be, we learn a lot of biblical things through Psalm. Take our children classes, for example. So having these songs with all these biblical references, would you think that they were singing, and hopefully encourage them to not fall into this thing?
Very good. We have been brought into this story. It is good for us to sing this history. Why? Because if we sing the failure of humanity, we can also sing the faithfulness of God in the midst of that. Thank you for your participation.